you tell me what you saw on Friday?
Well, it was just glinting in the trees. And there was a man, and he walked towards us, and he walked back again.
And what does he look like?
His face was like this, and his eyes were down here.
Like, what, further down his face?
Yeah, much further down than us, because our eyes are here, his are down.
You don't think it was somebody in fancy dress doing a prank or something? And how tall about?
About, say there, sitting on the spaceship.
How do you know it was a spaceship? Wasn't it a helicopter or something like that?
Well, it looked like it was like a disc, like a round.
And whereabouts was it?
Well, in the trees over there, between the pole.
And did you girls see that as well?
Yes.
We asked them to draw pictures of what they saw on Friday, and after looking at those, I definitely feel that they did see something.
What do you think that was?
I agree that it could be something that we are not common with. But to actually say that it was a UFO, I would be reluctant to make a decision like that.
Hey everybody, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about a very interesting event that happened in Zimbabwe. It was a UFO sighting outside of Ruwa, Zimbabwe. It was on September 16th of 1994. There were 69 pupils at the Ariel School, aged between, I'd say, 6 and 12. They all claimed that they saw one or more silver aircraft descend from the sky and land in a field nearby their school. One or more creatures, they may have been cited as having worn black, and the children claim that there was some conversations that may or may not happen between the two, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And there was a theme behind it, so this is a very interesting topic. So, kind of leading into that, I've got Nicole here, and she's going to bring us some more information about it. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. So this incident is extremely interesting. It is something that when I saw it, I was very passionate about. I have worked with children for over 20 plus years, in different facets of life, Mm-hmm. And so I really wanted to get into the investigation of this because while it happened when I was a child, probably about the same age as these children would have been, maybe a little bit older than them, I can't imagine seeing something like that.
Sure.
And then having people, around the world hear about it, how that affects your life, basically. Yeah. And that's kind of what we're get into, because there's going to be skeptics. There's going to be those that totally believe you or go above and beyond what you said you seen,
Sure.
know.
So sort of setting up the the area which this event happened. Ruwa is a small agricultural center, and it's located roughly about 22 kilometers from the east of capital Harare. A fairly impoverished area. A lot of agricultural workers were there. And there's a lot more to that, but I'm just trying to set up a little bit of a landscape. And it looks like most of this incident pretty much encompassed that entire area. For 2 days prior to the incident, there were many UFO sightings. Okay, and it was all throughout South Africa. They've been passing through the sky, and many people, I guess the ZBC, which is a local radio station, called out to say, hey, what are you guys seeing? And there were a lot of people that reported seeing, different types of aerial phenomenon. And although witnesses interpreted it as a fireball or a meteor, it resulted in a very large wave of UFO mania in Zimbabwe. And according to a skeptic, Brian Dunning, the fireball had been a re-entry of the Zenit 2 rocket from the Cosmos 2290 satellite launch. The report is the booster broke up into burning pieces and it streaked across the sky, giving the impression of that glow and that impressive light, and it was seen by millions of Africans. I will say being someone who absolutely loves space exploration and is big into, NASA and things like that. In fact, I was a planetary science minor, so it was right up my alley. There are some very distinctive things that you see when there's a reentry of something of this nature. And as we get further into the story, you're going to see that it absolutely does not follow that same trajectory. So, at any rate, a local UFO researcher, Cynthia Hine, recorded other alien sightings at this time, including daylight sightings of a young boy and his mother, and report of an alien beings being on the road by a trucker. I think it's a good time to pivot to the event that happened at Ariel School. So then I'm going to go ahead and let Nicole kind of start us off with the incident.
Okay, so this happened during the morning. It says at 10 a.m. on September 16th, 1994. And the kids had just gone outside on their morning break. And so this was a longer recess, basically, because the teachers were all inside having a staff meeting.
Right.
So the kids were super excited. They were outside playing cricket and different games. And as one witness described, that they used to have these big logs kind of out on the playground as a kind of a perimeter to tell the kids where to kind of stay inside of.
Kind of like their own cones.
Yeah. I mean, they're just big logs, basically. There's no fencing or anything around it, but just to kind of, don't go outside this area because you are in Africa. So there are wild animals and stuff. But they were outside playing. They say that, or the teachers say, basically it probably could have only lasted 10 to 15 minutes because from when they started the meeting to when the kids, notified them of something was about 10 to 15 minutes. Which
is interesting because for adults, that would be a very probably insignificant amount of time.
Right. For children.
I would imagine for children, that's a pretty long section of time.
But they don't know for sure. They don't know how long it was there, how long, this was going on before they were notified.
Sure.
So they were playing, and there are a bunch of different testimonies, basically, from all the different kids, because you got to understand this is a pretty big playground area.
Right.
There were different ages. They were all out there at the same time.
Sure.
They had the young, and then they had the older kids. And, of course, the older kids are going to be playing with their age. The younger kids are going to be playing with their age. Some were eating lunch, So they were in different areas of the playground. So when it comes to their testimony, they all saw the same thing, but in different descriptions.
Sure.
From where they were on the playground. Some didn't notice it right away, where the others that were closer to where it happened, it was like immediate.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. What most of them have said in the beginning is they heard a sound. Okay. Some describe it as a buzzing sound. Some describe it, these are children.
Sure.
And working with children, they don't usually know how to describe things. They don't know the words for things, especially when you're talking about a younger child. Some of the older ones, we get better witness testimony because they know the words. They know how to explain it. But when you're talking
honestly,
about...
we get lucky sometimes if adults can even do that.
Well, yeah. But and I work with young children.
Right.
Usually under the age of 6. They don't know how to describe things.
No.
They only know from their world how to describe it.
Right.
And so, I noticed in a lot of the witness testimony of the older kids, they described it as like an energy source, like a buzzing, like that type, like if you're near, something electrical. Mm-hmm. And that makes sense. For the young kids that we're talking about, they said it sounded like a flute sound, like a whistling sound, I guess. And that in their, perspective, that's how they know how to describe it. Right. So I think a lot of them heard that. Most of the kids, all ages, heard that sound, and they kept looking up, and then they would say they saw, this silver whatever in the sky, right? But the ones that were closest to the incident then saw something land between the trees, like on the outskirts, probably. I don't know how far away this was supposed to be, but it was pretty close.
Right.
And then we'll get into more of this in a second, but, they, like, a few kids ran inside and told the teachers, hey, something's here, and they shoot them away. Oh, go away. Right? Because they're, teachers are not
just
going to...
dismissing it as imagination.
Well, yeah, this is the last thing on their minds. This could be anything.
Right.
And so, then the kids kept coming back, though. Like, different kids kept coming back in, like, mass hysteria. Like, something's going on. And so finally, in the third or fourth time of a kid coming in, one of the teachers stepped outside to see, what are they...
Right, like what the heck's going on?
Essentially freaking out about, right?
Yeah.
And she is the one that said that she saw something take off into the sky.
Oh, I didn't even realize this. So the teacher actually said that.
Yeah, only one teacher. Because she was the, probably one on the low totem pole was like, go see what the kids are fussing about.
They're lackey.
Right? Yeah.
Hey, whipping boy, go check outside.
Right, and then once that happened, then, I'm sure the staff meeting all broke up. And, because they could hear kids screaming and crying. And, I mean, there was something going on, right? Mm-hmm. And, of course, these kids went home, told their parents, and their parents were like, what? And then the next day and following days, they had teachers at the school. And these are wealthy families, the majority. So they want to know. They're paying tuition for these kids.
Of course.
What is going on here? They wanted answers. And the fallout, I mean, there was tons of different people that came to investigate this over the following days. And this happened on a Friday. Okay. So they had the whole weekend, and then that next week there was just, the BBC came.
Yeah. So it basically turned into,
and I think they were the
like
first ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
The BBC, so this guy, Tim Leach, that worked for the BBC, he was basically a reporter for them, and he had visited Zimbabwe several times for the wars and stuff that were going on. So, he got all this. He came on September 19th. Okay, so that's 3 days after?
Yeah.
To film interviews. And there's actually, you can see the BBC interview that he does with the kids, okay? And he said that I could handle these war zones reporting on this, but I couldn't handle this because I didn't know what to make of it, basically. Right. And I think further down the line, this guy, which I've seen interviews with him, he's very Ozzy Osbourne. That's what I like to relate him to, which is awesome. But he, it kind of destroyed his career.
Sure did.
Because, nobody wants to put any credit to something like this.
Right.
And so he didn't do so well anymore in the BBC after all this happened.
That's insanely unfortunate. You get these... Everybody always says, well, there's no evidence. Nobody could corroborate. We need people of higher stature to, to second this information. Yet you get it. And now all of a sudden, well, we got to discredit them because there's no way that could have actually happened.
Well, and I'm sure a lot of these instances is they think, okay, well, we're going to send these reporters out. We're going to go and make fun of it. Find the loophole here and then report that. But he couldn't find the loophole. And I think that's where they're like, oh, well, we can't further investigate this. It was like, it was a thing that it was going to stop, Then
they got to black hole it and it's over with.
Yeah. So, like you said earlier, the ZBC radio is the local radio, and they were having people call in about other sightings. Well, then they reported about this incident with the school, okay? And this lady, she... her name is Cynthia Hind, okay, and she's like a UFO researcher. She's like a scientist, okay? Mm-hmm. So she heard about it on the radio and decided to visit the school, okay? So she went and she interviewed a bunch of the kids on September 20th. So she's there a day after the BBC. Okay. She also brought a guy with her that, had radioactive...
A Geiger counter.
Yeah, detective equipment with him and stuff, and she was going to do the whole thing, right? Yeah. And what's interesting is she has investigated a lot of these types of things across Zimbabwe, across, other countries, I think. And so she did investigative work. I mean, she interviewed the kids, looked at where, this was supposedly happened. What she did find is she said, these kids all had diverse backgrounds. It's not like they were all local Zimbabwe kids.
Sure.
Some were from, England. Some were from India. They were all, different. Yeah, basically, so there's black African children from several of the tribes located there. There were Asian children where, some of their bloodline came from India. Sure. There was white children. That most of them had been born there in Zimbabwe, but their parents were from like South Africa or Britain, because there's a lot of British people in those areas.
Right.
They were all from wealthy families, but they described the features of what they saw in different ways. Mm-hmm. But it was essentially the same story.
Sure. So almost a different perspective.
Because they didn't really have anybody. I mean, they had people asking them, just tell us what happened.
Sure.
And so I don't think they necessarily felt like that was happening to them. But they said the same thing. And when you see the emotion on their face that comes from them, and some of these young kids were terrified, and you can see the fear, and they're crying as they're talking about it. I mean, that hit home with me, because it's like, I totally believe them. I don't have a question on this one that any of this was false, because there's all these skeptics like, oh, it's mass hysteria, or they planned all this, right? Some of the teachers are like, well, they planned this whole thing, Okay, in 10 to 15 minutes, you've got 60-some kids of all different ages that planned this story of a craft landing, and we're going to tell all the same stuff, and we'll get to more of the stuff that happens later.
Right.
I'm sorry, but that can't happen.
No.
Because a kid will break, and kids love to tell on each other.
Yeah, they sure do.
I mean, think about your own kids. They want to tattle on each other.
There's always the enforcer.
Yeah, there's always somebody that's going to break.
Right.
And be like, oh, we just made it up, or whatever. I mean, and what the scrutiny these kids went on later in their lives, they would eventually say, yeah, we just made it up. But there's no way. Even adults, 60-some adults can't do that, and little kids, they're not going to do that. I'm sorry, But anyway.
I mean, arguably, some of these kids that turn into adults probably wish they did make it up.
Well, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, till this day, they say that they saw it.
Right.
I mean, they did all these interviews. They actually had the kids come in and had them draw pictures of what they saw.
Okay.
With and they all essentially drew basically the same thing, which is crazy, in different ways of what they saw. And we've got pictures that we're going to put up of these drawings that the children did.
Yeah, we'll put that on, of course, the Facebook group, and when I do edit our video, for sure.
Most of the kids said that they were short-looking beings, that came out of the craft. They described very large eyes. Like some of the kids said, they said they're in the middle of the face, on the sides of their head, and said they were very big, and they all of them said they were black.
Right.
Some of the older kids described them as like an American football is what they said, because they knew how to describe it that way. But the little kids were like the big eyes, pointy at the end, and so that is all consistent. A lot of them said that they were wearing black, or their skin was black, something like that, but that the head was silver, or like clear looking, like a whitish, like translucent.
That's kind of wild.
They didn't know how to describe that, and it was very smooth, like, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like they didn't know how to describe it.
Like no friction to it at all, just like almost like a pane of glass.
One of the kids said that he thought at first that it might have been a gardener that they knew about, but then he saw that the figure had long, straight black hair, but it didn't look like a black person's hair like that he was used to seeing.
Okay.
Like
sure.
An African. Mm-hmm. And so he realized that's not what it was.
Right.
Okay. Some of them thought, because there were Zimbabwe bush kids there, thought that it could have been, and I don't know how to pronounce this, a Zvikwambo.
Yeah,
which is a spirit of a human raised by magic, because they've got that magical thing with them.
Sure.
Or a Tokoloshi, which is an evil goblin. There's a creature of folklore there, I guess. And those kids that thought that's what it was burst into tears, thinking that they were going to come eat them, basically, because they thought they were goblins, right? Because they didn't have any... They knew they weren't human.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
And how else would you, as a child of that age, even be able to rationalize that other than doing that?
Well, you couldn't. I mean, that's the thing. And what we find later is they grow up, and what I see is that these adults have PTSD.
Absolutely. And I'll go ahead and kind of speak to that a little bit. As listeners may or may not know, I'm a man of military background. I suffer from PTSD. Nicole's seen it on many occasions. And you can usually... There's some good, clear indicators or markers or whatever you want to call it from someone suffering from PTSD, and from the interviews and the different things that have followed them since the incident. I mean, I never want to say anything's classic PTSD because it rears its head in so many different ways, and it takes years and years to unpack. So there's no cookie cutter PTSD, but I see myself in so many of those stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So after she had, Cynthia Hine had visited, I think Tim Leach, because he knew the BBC wasn't going to do anything beyond that first, interview.
Yeah.
He made a call to a professor of psychiatry at Harvard University, Dr. John Mack. Mm-hmm. And he said, this is what has happened. There's been this sighting, would you come and, talk to these children? Mm-hmm. Okay. So it was a couple of months after. So it was in November of 1994. And he talked to these children individually. He did his psychoanalysis on them and, asked them questions.
Right.
And he had, I guess, previously, published a book on UFOs. So he was invested in the topic, so he really wanted to kind of dig into this.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And I've seen clips of him, of him interviewing these students, and it's very, very much a psychoanalysis.
Right.
He's letting them speak in their own words. He's not leading them. Mm-hmm. He's just, having them describe their feelings. And I don't think up to that point anybody had done that. It was just like, what did you see?
Sure.
Draw me what you saw. And this was more about the feeling of how they felt when it happened, what they were doing at the time, which is what you do in psychology,
right.
Because
you basically have them unpack it for themselves.
Right. You bring the memory to the forefront. He would, I think Cynthia Hine interviewed them in groups of 4 to 6, where he kind of separated them by themselves, and
which I would imagine that's probably good, because that you're not around other peers, so maybe you can relax a little bit.
Right. So what Mack found basically across all of these interviews is they all described seeing basically, or hearing the sound, of course, first. And then seeing a silver disc in the sky, landing in between the trees and the brush. Okay. They all describe kind of a disc shape, or a round at the top, flat at the bottom. One kid talked about how there was a platform around it, on the outside, and that they saw these creatures emerge, short creatures in black. Some had the long black hair, some did not. The thing that I find interesting is, some kids talked about how they were just staring at them with their eyes, staring at them. And they talked about one that was walking across the field, but when they say walking, they don't mean some of the older kids described it as how a man would walk on the moon.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, that's slow. They said, but the little kids said slow motion, slowly, but very, fluid, and it was just weird. And then they would see them, but then not see them. Yeah,
that is so weird. When I saw that interview, that honestly, that scared me more than any of it.
Yeah, they said that it would go from if it started, let's say if it started from the right side and went to the left, they never saw it go from the left to the right again. It was just reappear back in the original spot that it was. And so this one was moving around, but then they didn't know if they saw multiple, or if they saw only 2, or if they were just disappearing and reappearing again. Right. They couldn't really tell. These are young kids. I mean, they're probably frightened to death.
At 49 this year, that would literally put me in panic.
Yeah. And, you know, what they all describe, the majority of them describe, which this is the thing that is extremely creepy. And this is what John Mack actually got them to talk about, because he said, you know, what were they doing, basically? And they said, well, they were staring with the big eyes staring at me. And he's like, and what were you doing? Well, I was staring back at them. And they, you know, and how did you feel? And, you know, of course, they all said terrified, but I wanted to look. Like, it's like they had this pulling to look at them.
Sure.
Almost like they were in a trance.
Yeah.
You know, and they described the feeling as being afraid, but also being excited. Like their heart was pumping, but then it would calm down and then it would pump again. Like they wanted to be a part of it, but they also wanted to turn around and run away.
Yeah.
But like they almost couldn't. Like they wanted to know. And he asked them, you know, what do you think they wanted? What do you know? And he's like, I think they wanted me to come with them. Like, they all said that.
Yeah, that is frightening.
Like, the ones that he interviewed, of the clips that I've seen, is like, I feel like they wanted me to come, you know? But I knew I shouldn't, but I still kind of wanted to. And so, you know, he said, and he, you know, got that across about, they said they wanted to come with you. And he's like, well, how do you know that? And they said, or, you know, the older kids said communicated, and others just said, it was just in my head. He's like, well, what do you mean by that? You know, what do you mean? How did it get in your head?
Right.
You know? And he's a fantastic psychiatrist, I think, watching his process of this.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
And they basically said, I don't know, it was just in there. Like, and the little kid said through his eyes, into my eyes, basically. Yeah. So I would say, like, telepathically, they were communicating with these kids. Like, and it's like they were in a trance while they were looking at them. And they were, you know, wanting them to come to them.
That is, you know...
Now, whether they were in a state of fear and they were just frozen, you know, that could be more...
Sure.
What it was of, like, being curious. Because kids are very curious. And they are less afraid of some things than most adults are. Because we already have our preconceived notions of things.
Sure.
You know? So they're very curious, and they would be more likely to be the ones to go investigate something.
Right.
So... whether they were just in kind of a state of fear but excitement at the same time, which is what most of them have described being,
right,
that's most likely what the case was with that.
Yeah, and even to expand a little bit on that, and I agree, but I'm also in the camp a little bit of, I could see that with 10, 12, maybe a handful of kids, but I get the sense that they were all kind of locked in like that, and it would be... in my humble opinion, it would be really difficult for every one of them to be that. I mean, granted, they were all frightened, no question about that.
Yeah.
But for every single one of them to be dialed in like that, I mean, I can't even get, you know, 3 kids to listen to me at one particular time, let alone 60 some odd, you know. So even to that point, I almost feel sometimes could there have been something that these creatures were doing to like, get them all locked in?
Well, that's to the next point.
Right.
He basically asked them, well, why do you think they did that? You know, what's your thought, you know, on why they wanted you to be there looking at them, you know? All the kids had different, I mean, they're essentially the same thing, but they had different things of the way they basically interpreted it. So there was one kid that said that... he was a 5th grader, I think, and he said he was warned that something was going to happen. Okay? And he said, well, what something? And he said, well, that we shouldn't have pollution. Okay?
Yeah.
So, and these are all environmentally themed, which is what I find interesting.
Sure. Okay?
And then there was an 11-year-old girl that said... I think they want people to know that we're actually making harm on this world, and we mustn't get too technologized is the word she used.
Right.
But basically, we're using too much technology.
Sure. We're inundated with technology.
There was another kid that said that he was told that the world would end because they are not taking care of the planet. So we are not taking care of the planet. That is terrifying.
It's absolutely terrifying. And what I find...
it's terrifying, not for me that they're telling us this. It's terrifying that we are making that big of a mess of our own planet that it is getting out there in outer space. The other beings know about it. That is what is terrifying to me.
Absolutely. And
this is 94.
Right. And I was about to say, with it being in 1994, yes, environmental causes were a thing. Absolutely. I'm old enough to remember all that. However, it is not the current political hotbed of craziness that it is right now. You know,
right. Back then, nobody was doing much except for cleaning out the rivers. And,
right. So to think that way back in 1994, how in the world could these kids have that in their head? Especially, they wouldn't. Especially in Africa, where they don't have, and we had mentioned before that this was a very agrarian area.
Well, you know, when I was a child in 94, barely older than these kids, I didn't think about any of that stuff until I got to be an adult, because, now we're at a crossroads.
Right.
Now it's dangerous, and that's the only reason anybody's thinking about it.
Yeah, and that's why
we wait till the last possible minute to do anything about it.
Sure.
So that's what's it's crazy to me. And this next quote comes from a little girl named Liesl Field. And it honestly, it makes me emotional because it kind of breaks my heart, because this is our future if we don't stop. Yeah. Okay? Whether or not you believe in it or not, it's going to happen if we don't stop. But she said that this creature sent her a message through the eyes. This is the one I was talking about. She said through the eyes. It was like in the world, all the trees would just go down and there would be no air and people will be dying. I think that in space there is no love, but down here there is. And that was the quote from her.
Wow.
And he asked her, what do you think they want you to do with that? And she said, well, I don't know. And his interpretation of it was that they're not like warning us and telling us you better do this or giving us a solution to stop. It's just basically, hey, this is happening.
Right.
Just like making us aware that this is happening.
Yep.
Not necessarily telling us these are the steps you need to do, just like this is what will happen. And maybe we don't know, did they do the same thing to their planet?
Sure.
Have they had to leave? Maybe they're, way advanced and they know they followed the same path. Maybe they're trying to tell us.
And also to add to that, there are in some ways, we talk about the paranormal. There's a ton of things we cover on this podcast, whether that be from ghosts or cryptids, whatever have you, and of course UFOs. And out of all of them, I think I'm probably the most passionate about UFOs. And the reason for that is something that, as this story here shows you, it doesn't matter where in the world you are. There are experiences worldwide with this. And that's a given. The things we're doing to our planet, and who could be telling this, there are a lot of people that believe it's us. There are people that believe that humanity existed at one point and left and went and lived and are currently living in other planets and other universes and everything else. Now, I know that's a big stretch and I know that's a lot to chew, but if that were the case and these were human beings and maybe they lived here, maybe they didn't, maybe they were close, they were still a human race. I mean, when you unpack a lot of different things, and I know this is going really deep into the woods, but at one particular point, this is scientifically proven that Venus, Earth, and Mars were all exactly the same. They all could have sustained life. They all had rivers. They all had oceans. They had everything we enjoy today on Earth. And the reason why Venus lost it is it was too close to the sun, so it burned it all up and turned it into a hotbed of gases. And the reason why Mars doesn't have it is because it was too far from the sun and it just froze the heck up. So who are we to say, and I know this is a very big departure in what we're talking about, but who's to say that humanity didn't exist on either one of those planets and had to leave? Mm-hmm. Maybe those are the ones coming back saying, hey, idiot, you don't even have to look too far. Look to your left and look to your right.
Working with kids is a passion for me. It always has been, because they're young innocents, And, everybody's like, well, why is one of the biggest UFO incidents ever happen to a bunch of kids, right? Why didn't it happen to adults that can do it? Because adults, like I said before, we already have our preconceived notions.
Right.
We have made our minds up about something, and most are very closed-minded. They're, they're not going to listen.
Right.
Whereas the children are the next generation. They're the ones that, if they have an experience like this, that are more likely to try to change the world and do something about it. The reason I was interested in this story is because I already have that, I'm very connected to nature. I love nature.
Right.
And maybe that's the warning. Don't become, what was the quote? Don't become too technological or...
Right, technologed
is what the kid said, but do not become more technological, because I don't think it was just about the environment. I think it's also about us.
And that's where I kind of sometimes go, that's a very human thing to say to another human. They are looking out for humanity. Mm-hmm. And these visitors had that in mind. So, yeah, I mean, kind of down the back, because, wow, there's so many layers to this,
Yeah.
And it's so complex. But what were some of the after effects? I mean, what happened with this moving after, Mack did his interviews? Well,
I guess he wrote a book. I guess it's a book called Passport to the Cosmos. Mm-hmm. And he said after some years of research, he was astonished to discover in case after case, powerful messages about the human threat to the Earth's ecology were being conveyed to the experiences in vivid, unmistakable words and images. He personally deemed it quite possible that the protection of the Earth's life is at the heart of the abduction phenomenon, because after this, he got really heavy into it. Okay. Sure. I feel really sorry for this man because I think he was a brilliant psychiatrist. Mm-hmm. And most people, when they experience something that they don't understand, they get quite passionate about it.
Sure.
And when you're passionate about something that most people don't believe, they quote you as being crazy or, off your rocks or whatever. And he was a Harvard doctor,
he was
doctor of psychiatry.
Right. He was a Harvard doctor of psychiatry and a Pulitzer Prize winner.
Yeah. So you go back to Harvard after this experience and say, hey, I want to investigate alien abductions. What do you think Harvard's response was?
Yeah, I can imagine.
So he almost lost his standing. He had a prominent office, and they moved him off campus into this tiny office. They did have a board of people that went over, and he kept his standing. They gave him his standing back because they found he wasn't, basically crazy. But I mean, Tim Leach, he basically became nothing for the BBC after that.
Yeah, they absolutely
and now
killed his
Dr.
career.
Mack, was touted as being crazy, in the U.S. The only one that didn't is the Cynthia Hinn, but she was already a UFO.
Yeah, she was already what people probably consider on the fringe of science anyway.
Right, so this probably actually helped her career.
I'm sure it did, yeah.
As far as those two, they took a beating for it, to try to stand up and say, hey, this happened. They tried to help these kids.
Yep.
The one thing I did find is a sighting the day before by some of the kids.
Oh, okay.
Which a lot of people don't know. But I guess some of the kids had drawn, when they drew the pictures, they drew one object that looked like a cigar, and they labeled it Thursday, and then on Friday they labeled the dome-shaped one. She said two boys... Well, this was actually... Let me preface this by saying there was another person. This was the guy that built the Geiger counter and everything that was with her. Mm-hmm. He's the one that talked to them. So two boys told him that on Thursday, September 15th, they saw a craft with flashing lights flying above the power lines at the other end of the playground. It was moving and then disappeared instantly, and then reappeared somewhere else and then vanished. So they went to the location where this happened, because at on the Friday one, they didn't find any, but it was kind of flat ground there, so they didn't find anything from where the kids. But for the Thursday one, they said that they saw it. They went, and there was flattened grass and wedge markings where maybe legs of a craft had gone down into the ground. Okay, there are pictures of this, by the way, that we will put up.
We'll put them up, yeah.
And they said, the earth was really dry. Because there had been kind of a drought in Zimbabwe at the time.
Right.
So it wasn't like it was wet where somebody could have pushed something in. This was something heavy.
Yeah.
And the grass is really tall, by the way. It's 4 foot tall, 5 foot tall. And it was all flattened in a circular pattern. Okay.
what I find interesting, and I don't know if you're going to cover this here in a second or not, but there have been so many sightings of like the Tic Tac. And there are a lot of ufologists that believe that the Tic Tac is a drone. So it kind of falls in line a little bit with that if it's a drone, so you
checked it out
right,
first?
you send your drone out to check it out, make sure nothing crazy is going on, and that's when you come in, 24 hours, I guess, afterwards. I don't know.
Well, I did a little bit more research about this. Like, okay, well, if there's a sighting by the kids the day before, well, then clearly it's got to be seen other places, right?
Yeah.
So apparently, it says a UFO was tracked on radar twice a day before their encounter. An unidentified object traveling across the Atlantic at high speed was pinged first by Mexican radar, then shortly after by commercial radar operators from Johannesburg and South Africa, adding that radar contact was eventually tracked to a location near the Zimbabwean border with Botswana. So they tracked this before these kids saw that. So that's even more credibility.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing that, while we have all this technology and we can track all this, now all of a sudden, we track an object from, Mexico to Zimbabwe, but what does it do? Disappear? Now it shows up in front of kids, but it didn't happen,
Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, and of course the skeptics come out and they say, well, this didn't happen. It was mass hysteria, that the kids were playing a prank, and and I say it the way I'm saying it because it's just ridiculous at this point. You're always going to try to find something, Right. They're saying that and of course, like I said before, people always discount kids because they're kids, right? But I don't find that to be true. Yeah, you can tell when things are imagined and when they're not, when you're talking about Santa or the Easter Bunny, things that we've told them are true, and, but they don't claim that they've seen them.
Which, spoiler alert, kids.
Yeah, they just
if you're
believe
listening, you
in
shouldn't be. Right.
And they say that the kids in Zimbabwe would not have exposure to modern media, so they wouldn't have known about UFOs. And then, of course, they couldn't, debunk that, so they went after, Cynthia Hind and John Mack, basically. And saying that, the way they interviewed the kids was, allowed to listen, so then their stories are all exactly the same. What they've said, they are not the same. They're not the same story. Yeah. They are identical in what the description of the craft looked like, the description of the aliens, but they all have different stories of how they saw it and how they felt. Although they were very similar, they weren't identical. And if kids are going to plan something, they're going to try to make it identical.
Right.
Yeah, Emily Trim is interesting. Her and her brother were there at the school. She's one of them that, saw something. We have a, picture of what she drew, and basically, it's the oval shape, craft with legs and like stairs coming down. And on her picture, she writes, it was silver shining, it was oval shaped. Okay. Her parents were very religious, I think, just Christian.
Yeah,
I don't know
Christian,
what,
I think.
But so I don't know that they disbelieved her. They know that something happened, but they wouldn't allow themselves to go into it because it questions their faith. So they immediately pulled their kids out and took off to Canada. Yeah. And what she says is they never talked about it. So this was repressed, and her brother, I think, had, lots of nightmares and stuff afterwards. She was clearly a mess as an adult. Right. But she is someone that has come out about it, and she talks about it now. She traveled back to the school. Yeah. And visited, and and you could see the PTSD. Oh, sure. In her from it, And she's actually an artist, so she draws what she remembered. And up to that point, she hadn't seen the drawing that she made when she was a kid because the school still had it. When she went back, they were able to find it and show it to her, and she's like, this is exactly what I draw in my art now. Yeah. That's not a made-up thing.
No, it's not.
Yeah, so she's very interesting. Her witness testimony is saying she remembers playing outside on those logs I talked about, where like the perimeter. And she's the one that said that the beings were, like, the head was translucent looking and that they reached out, okay, to her. And she personally feels, she was on another podcast, and she said that she feels that maybe some of the kids were actually taken on the craft and brought back and they don't remember it. She said because for 10 to 15 minutes for this to be going on is an awful long time to just be staring at something and nothing happening.
Yeah.
But, I mean, she doesn't remember anything if that actually did.
And what's to say that if they got all the way here, that they couldn't bend time and, you know.
Well, yeah, if they were in slow motion.
Right, they're moving in slow motion. I mean, that's scary as you know what.
And then there's another witness as an adult now that in 2014, the Mail and Guardian, they spoke to her, but she didn't want to release her name.
Yeah.
You know, of course.
Of course.
You know. But she said that she fears that they will return, and then she can sense when they're back in the atmosphere every time they come. So there's some connection there. The one thing, and this is a quote from her, so I apologize for the one curse word that's in it, but
let it fly. We'll throw an E on this episode.
Yeah, she said they weren't wrong though about the environmental shit, were they?
Yeah.
If you go out there now, you'll see the Miambo forests have disappeared for firewood.
Yep.
So that was her one big statement that she said. She said it happened. She goes, I don't like talking about it, basically, you know, her whole interview. And she didn't say a lot, but that was one big statement that she said. She goes, they were right about it.
They were. They're absolutely right.
You know, not to throw the environmental, but that seems like the main mission for appearing to these kids.
Potentially you have an alien species come down and tell you that what you're doing is really impacting where you live. And I think, like what you said, they chose a specific audience for a reason. I think they took that Tic Tac, they went down there, they saw, hey, there's this really agrarian area that if anybody's going to be impacted by environmental issues,
right,
it's going to be them.
Well, and there's like there's like 100 kids, I think, or so outside, and 60 some of them saw this.
Right. So
that's a huge audience.
Oh, I mean, that's, you know, what, 60%?
They're not going to get this anywhere else.
Right, you know.
Unless they land right in the middle of a big city.
Yeah, and even then, they probably think that, you know, it was some kind of stunt or event set up. But,
yeah.
But was there anything else you wanted to cover?
We'll, you know, post, we've got lots of pictures.
Okay.
But I found some of the drawings from the kids, you know. The one that I don't think I mentioned yet is there was a few kids that said something about how it was very shimmery, like the craft was shimmery. Mm-hmm. And there's one picture here of a kid that drew, it kind of looks like a starburst looking with blue. But the quote was like, it shone like water in the sun. So maybe like when they talked about it, it was like it kind of like went, you know, when they talked about how they could see it, but then they couldn't see
like
it.
Translucent.
Yeah, so like maybe it was coming in and out of their vision. That's what I think, personally, that means.
Or maybe they were coming back and forth and they were getting abducted.
Who knows?
I
mean, but that's how a kid would describe something like that.
Right.
But, you know, there's quite a few drawings I've got on here. Of course, we've got Emily's on here.
Right.
You know, and what I find fascinating is they're so much alike.
Yeah. I mean, there's variations, but again, at the core,
but it's from what they remember.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. If they all made... You got 60 kids in a playground ages 6 to 12. In 10 minutes, they're coming up with a story about how they saw this thing land. They're not going to collaborate and be like, okay, well, because they don't know what's coming after that. They're not going to go inside the school, all draw essentially the same thing. Well, make sure that you know, you're going to tell a 6-year-old kid, make sure that you draw it like this, with this underneath, with the trees here, and with the person looking like, come on now.
Right. I mean,
you're not going to do that. You can't even get adults to do that.
No. And what's funny about that is you can't expect, you know, just a couple of kids of your own. You go upstairs and something happens and then something breaks. You come downstairs and there's 17 different stories of what it could have possibly been, up
yeah.
to and including that you did it, even though you were upstairs.
I just want you to know, Dad, that I wasn't there.
Yeah, I wasn't there.
Right?
Oh, man.
And I mean, it's just, I know people are going to try to disprove it. And me personally, as far as how I view aliens, I think there is life out there, because I don't think one of my favorite movies is Contact.
Oh, yeah. Great movie.
Yeah. And, Matthew McConaughey and
Jodie Foster. Yeah, it took me a second.
because it kind of goes with that whole, like, she, doesn't really believe in God, but
Right.
he's, he does. But she's, a scientist, and they hear this sound, essentially, right? And she feels that she's been taken and shown something in another planet, but it only passed on Earth within a few seconds.
Right.
And people, of course, do the thing that we do, and broke her down and said she was crazy and all this stuff. And he stands by her side and says, I believe you, because he has faith in other things. We can't, and one of my favorite quotes from that movie, and I don't know if I'll get it exactly because it's been a very long time since I've watched it, is he says, basically, when he stands up for her, he goes, she says this. A little kid actually asks her, basically if there's life on other planets, and she said, well, she doesn't say yes or no. She says, well, I just think there's a huge, world and a huge universe. It'd be pretty crazy to think we're the only ones that exist.
Yeah, that's actually pretty close.
I don't know exactly how she says it, but I just remember like that making a huge impact on me when I was a kid watching this movie, because it's true.
Yeah.
Why would we have this huge universe and we be the only things allowed to live on it?
Yeah, and that's a Carl Sagan quote, actually. And I think it was, I think you got most of it right, but if I remember right, it's if there wasn't any other life out there, it would be an awful waste of space, I think is something around that
something
nature,
like that.
But
Yeah,
that was Carl Sagan. Yeah.
And what I like at the end of the movie is, the media's breaking her down, and he stands by her side and essentially says, well, he goes, I'm a man of faith, and we may disagree on that aspect of it. He goes, there could be something there. I believe her.
Yeah.
Because why would she lie about something like this?
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying? So that's my thought. I may not believe every alien, UFO, the abduction stuff.
Right.
I'm on the fence about that stuff because and one thing that was brought up in this whole thing I kept saying is seeing is believing, but you can't see everything.
Nope.
And
molecule,
the one thing they were talking about the Harvard thing is, one of the lawyers was like, that they're quick to investigate angels and all this ghosts and everything else, but when it comes to UFOs, it's like, no. Yeah, that's the line right. Where people now are crazy.
Right.
It's like you can't be open to all this stuff and then just say that. That's why we do this podcast, because there's so many paranormal things, and people, we are curious at birth. We're curious as children. We don't stop being curious. We just get busy with the mundane stuff of our life, and we stop thinking about it. But when you see something like this, or something happens to you, it changes your perspective of what's really important. And I think that's what happened to the BBC reporter, what happened to John Mack. They saw this on these kids' faces. They knew that they couldn't disprove it, and something actually happened, and it completely changed their trajectory of, their career and probably their personal lives, I would imagine. And that was more important than staying relevant into Harvard or staying relevant at the BBC. This was more important because they knew there was something else out there. And I'm sorry, but that's more important to investigate something like that. Yeah. It hits you on a personal level, I think. And so I'm more inclined to believe them and believe these kids than I am all the naysayers about, well, that didn't happen in this, because until it happens to you, you don't believe it. And it's just like with the ghost stuff. A lot of people don't believe in ghosts. And it's fine if you don't. Mm-hmm. But like you and I have had experiences Absolutely. Separate and together. And so I do believe in them.
Yeah.
But they're, you know, and most people that you speak to that don't believe in them have never had an experience. So how can you, that's why the seeing is believing is such a big thing, but you can't always see.
No.
Sometimes it's just a feeling, you know, and that's what I'm saying is like they didn't, you know, John Mack and was it Tim Leach didn't see this happen.
Nope.
They didn't need to see it happen. All they needed to see was these kids and the feeling they got from it, and that was enough for them.
Yeah, I mean, folks, I don't think there's any better way to segue from that. I mean, that is what we do on this show. That is what we explore. You know, it's sometimes it's just what you feel. It doesn't necessarily mean what you have to see. And you know, that is literally paranormal wrapped up in a bow. For full-length audio, you can listen to us wherever you get your podcast. And on YouTube, please consider liking and subscribing for new content every week.